Atlanta. Before the city wakes, before the first flight lifts off the tarmac, before anyone decides what kind of morning this is going to be. Hartsfield-Jackson International, Terminal B, the long corridor under fluorescent light that hums at a frequency just below what the human ear registers as sound. Conveyor belts moving, janitors versus a gateboard, clicking through departures, one man, walking, dark jacket, worn carry-on. No entourage, no urgency. The kind of man you look past without deciding to, which is, if you knew what he was carrying in his jacket pocket, exactly the point. Gate B14. First class. A woman in a pressed room looks up, looks at him, and something behind her eyes makes a decision before a single word is spoken. He reaches his seat. She steps forward, and the next 90 minutes will change everything for her, for this aircraft, for an industry that has been looking past the wrong people for a very long time. He had signed her paycheck for 9 years. She was about to tell him to go sit in economy, but that part comes later. First, there is Atlanta. There is 5:47 in the morning. There a man walking through Hartsfield with a carry-on bag worn at the corners and a $28 Timex on his wrist and absolutely nothing about him that tells you who he is, which is exactly how he planned it. James Whitfield moved through the terminal the way water moves through a room. No friction, no announcement, just present, going somewhere, the kind of man you look past without deciding to. The airport was already breathing. Conveyor belts grinding. Announcement system cutting through the recycled air. The smell of burnt coffee from 3 different concessions. All of it blurring together into something that was somehow still comforting at this hour. Janitors in yellow vests. A TSA agent waving people through with the glazed efficiency of someone 12 hours into a shift. A teenager in a Falcons jersey sprawled across 3 seats with his shoes off. Nobody looked at James. A woman with a rolling cart clipped his shin and kept walking without a backward glance. A gate agent in a glass booth looked up, looked through him, looked back at her screen. James felt the familiar weight of it settle into his chest. Not hurt. He was past hurt, past the age when visibility stung. Now it was more like recognitions, the way you recognize rain before it starts. You don't have to like it. You just know what to bring. He kept walking. He was 60 years old. He had built 3 companies from nothing. Collapsed once in 2008, the way everyone collapsed in 2008, and rebuilt. Slower the second time, smarter, more deliberate. For the past 11 years, he had been the chief executive officer of Apex Airways, a position he has arrived at through a combination of capital, strategy, and a particular kind of stubbornness that people in boardrooms called vision, and people who knew him called something else entirely. He held 25% of the company's equity. He sat on its board. He had approved the hiring budget that put every single crew member on today's flight into their current jobs. None of them knew his face. He preferred it that way. Usually. Today was different. He found a seat up near gate B14 and set his bag between his feet. Let himself have one moment of stillness before the day accelerated. He reached into his jacket and removed a single folded page. Printed at home that morning, because some things shouldn't stay on screens. 14 complaints. 14 separate passengers over the past 3 months. All Apex Airways flights. All domestic routes. All describing the same shape of experience, a boarding pass questioned when no one else's was. A seat reassigned without documentation. An upgrade confirmation that evaporated between the booking system and the gate. On a flight attendant's tone that shifted, subtly, plausibly, based on factors that had nothing to do with ticketing. None of the 14 had used the word discrimination directly. They rarely did. They said, "I felt unwelcome. I was made to feel like I didn't belong." I'm just not sure exactly what happened, but something happened. That something, that unprovable, utterly recognizable something, had arrived on Jim's desk via the anonymous complaint portal he'd quietly installed 18 months ago after 3 executive assistants told him, separately, that they'd heard things. He'd read all 14 complaints, read them twice, and then he'd done something that surprised even his executive assistant. He'd booked himself a first-class seat on Flight 11142, Atlanta to Houston. Under his real name, no corporate coordination, no security detail, just a man, a boarding pass, a seat he paid for. James refolded the page and put it back in his pocket. He looked up at the gate board, Flight 1142. On time. He thought about another morning. a different terminal, a younger version of himself who had also been invisibles, but for different scenes in a different context, with a different kind of damage waiting on the other side of the door. Atlanta, 1989. He was 25, freshly graduated, new shoes, borrowed tie, a resume his mother had proofread 3D times at their kitchen table in Decatur, her lips moving slightly over the words the way she did when something mattered. He'd made it to the interview, past the phone screen and the written assessment and the preliminary review. He'd gotten to the room. The interviewer's name was Gerald Hooper, 50s. Salt and pepper hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like a crown he'd forgotten about. Hooper had looked at the resume, then at James, then at the resume again, and then he'd said gently, and this was the thing, the gentleness of it, he'd said, "We're really looking for someone who fits the image of what we're building here. I'm sure you understand." Image. James had nodded. Thank. The man walked out into the hallway with his borrowed tie still knotted perfectly and stood there for 30 seconds, not moving, resume in hand. He understood exactly what had been said. He understood exactly what hadn't. That moment had calcified into fuel over the decades. The slow-burning, efficient kind that doesn't announce itself, just keeps going. He'd built his first company 4 years later, lost the second in 2008, built again, and eventually arrived at 25% ownership of the very industry that had once measured him by his image and found him lacking. Gerald Hooper was probably retired somewhere, probably had no idea. James had never told anyone this story. It felt too small, too personal. The wound had long since healed into something useful, and useful things don't need to be displayed. But this morning, with 14 complaints folded in his jacket, he thought about all the other people who didn't have 35 years and 2 rebuilt companies to absorb the hit. People who just had a boarding pass. He stood up, picked up his bag, gate B14. He was almost at the jetway entrance when he noticed the young woman, early 20s, standing just to the side of the door, holding a clipboard she clearly didn't need anymore. It was just something to hold. Her uniform was pressed to a standard that suggested she'd been up before 4. Her hair was pulled back tight. And she was doing this thing, breathing out slowly through her nose, counting, lips moving just slightly. The way people do when they're terrified and determined not to show it. James slowed. First time, she looked up, startled, then almost embarrassed at being startled. "Sorry, solo assignment." "First one?" She blinked, then laughed, brief, half surprised. "That obvious?" "The clipboard's empty," he said. She looked down at it, laughed again, more genuinely. "Ava Colton," she said, not offering a handshake, just filling the air the way people do when they're nervous. "James," he said, "you nervous about flying?" Genuine curiosity, nothing scripted about it, he considered. "No, flying I'm fine with." She nodded. Then after a beat, "I keep telling myself it's just a job. Learn the tasks, do the tasks, go home." "Is it working?" She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. "Not yet. It will," he said. He kept walking toward the jetway. He didn't tell her who he was. Of course he didn't. But he carried the image of her for a moment. The empty clipboard, the controlled breathing, the particular look of someone at the start of something, and thought about what it cost to begin. Inside the jetway, the air changed, cooler, contained, the mechanical smell of the bridge itself, the low hum of the plane waiting at the end. James walked the slope and stepped into the aircraft. The first-class cabin of an early morning flight has its own specific atmosphere. Overhead bins still half empty. Leather seats holding the cool, composed smell of space cleaned overnight. A man in a charcoal suit already settled in row 3, tablet open, eyes poving fast. Woman in her late 50s with expensive earrings and a cashmere throw she'd brought herself, looking out the window at the tarmac. 2 seats at the front of the cabin, empty. Seat 2A, his seat. James moved through the curtain and counted rows without thinking about it, the automatic navigation of someone who spent too many hours in the air, and stopped at row 2. Lifted his bag into the overhead, moved to sit. "Sir," he turned. A woman in her mid-30s stood in the aisle. Apex Airways uniform, regulation, dark hair pulled back, name tag Diana Cole. The way she said "sir" was technically polite. Technically everything it needed to be. But there was a quality to it underneath. Something efficient and decided, the voice of someone who had already reached a conclusion before the conversation started. "I think you may be in the wrong cabin," she said. She said it the way people say something they've said before. A line worn smooth. James looked at her. "Seat 2A, he said, right here. There may have been a system error," Diana said. "This seat has been reassigned." James reached into his jacket, removed his boarding pass, held it out. Diana did not look at it. "If you'll just follow me," she said, already half turning toward the curtain, already ending the conversation in her posture before it could become one. "I'd like you to look at the boarding pass," James said. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that isn't performed. The kind built over decades of situations exactly like this one, where the point wasn't to win an argument but to make a record. "Sir, the seat has been reassigned." "Evan, look." A beat, she looked, briefly. "The way you look at something when you've already decided it doesn't matter. I'll need to verify this with the system," she said. She went to the forward galley. James stood in the aisle. The man in the charcoal suit glanced up from his tablet. The woman with the cashmere throw kept her eyes on the window. Nobody intervened. Nobody said anything. Nobody did what people rarely do at 6 in the morning when they have a flight to catch, which is step to an awkward situation between a stranger and a crew member. James stood there. He was used to standing. Then he heard footsteps at the door. Ava Colton came through the jetway and into the cabin, clipboard gone now, scanner in hand, doing a final pre-board check. She stopped when she saw James in the aisle. Some shift shifted in her expression. Not recognition of him specifically. Recognition of the situation. "The way a thing looks before you understand what it is everything," she started. "Boarding pass question," James said evenly. Ava looked at the pass still in his hand. She took her scanner, and she scanned it. The screen went green. "Clear, valid. Seat 2A, no flags, no holds." Ava looked at it, looked at James, opened her mouth. Diana Cole came back from the galley. She saw Ava with the scanner. She crossed the cabin for 4 steps and took the iPad from Ava's hands. Not snatching it, not dramatically, just firmly. "The way you take something you've decided belongs to you." She turned the screen off. "I've got this," Diana said. To Ava, not to James. Ava didn't move immediately. She stood there a moment, holding the air where the scanner had been. Green. She'd seen it. Green. She looked at James. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that neither could have named out loud, but both understood. Troy Harmon appeared from the galley. Late 20s, easy confidence, the body language of someone who'd never been seriously wrong about anything yet. He positioned himself beside Diana, not leading, just present, the way a second stands. Reinforcing. "Hey man, you good?" Troy said to James. The hey man was doing a lot of work. Hey man as in we're all relaxed here. Hey man as in this doesn't have to be a thing. Hey man as in economy is that way and we've all got places to be. "I'm fine," James said. "Just a little mix-up with the seating," Troy said. "There's no mix-up," James said. "I have the right seat." Troy smiled, the smile of someone who'd learned that smiling made uncomfortable things easier. "Let me just check with the captain real quick." He disappeared forward. James sat down in seat 2A, not as a statement, not as theater. He just sat down because it was his seat, and that's what you do with a seat you've paid for. Diana noticed, said nothing. Not yet. The Webbs arrived 4 minutes later. Richard and Carol Webb, 50s, the kind of couple who moved through airport terminals with frictionlessness that had nothing to do with effort. The world simply arranged itself slightly around them, and they moved through the opening without noticing. Richard had a platinum luggage tag. Carol's carry-on cost more than James's first car. They were not bad people. He would decide this later and believe it. They just weren't paying attention. Diana stepped forward with a warmth that was different, texturally, unmistakably different from what she'd offered James. "Mr. and Mrs. Webb, welcome aboard. Let me show you to your seats." She gestured toward row 2. "This is my seat," James said. Richard Webb stopped, looked at James, looked at the seat, looked at Diana. "There's been a mix-up," Diana said smoothly. "We're getting it sorted." Richard nodded the way people nod when they trust that the person in uniform has things handled. He didn't ask questions. He accepted the champagne flute that materialized and settled into seat 2A beside Carol, like they'd always been there. James was still in the aisle seat, seat 2B, technically not his, but close enough that Diana's arrangement looked, from a distance, like the situation was under control. Richard was reading his phone. Captain Frank Slade emerged from the cockpit. This was unusual. Captains don't come out during pre-boarding for seat disputes, which meant Diana had said something specific to pull him out here, which meant this was already more than a clerical error. Frank Slade was 51, career pilot. The stillness of someone who'd spent 23 years in high-league environments. Not tense, just contained. A surface of deep competency. He looked at James the way Diana had looked at James, which told James everything. "Sir," Frank said, "I understand there's been some confusion." "There hasn't," James said. "Zmies is James Whitfield. I have a boarding pass for seat 2A, booked 3 days ago under my real name and paid in full. The pass was just scanned by your crew and came up valid. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't moved from this aisle. I've asked to see the system record that supposedly justifies a reassignment, and that request hasn't been answered." Frank absorbed this. "Our records show the seat was reassigned," he said. "By whom?" James asked. Frank looked at Diana. Diana said there was a system update during pre-board prep. "What time?" James asked. She didn't answer. "What time did the update occur?" Same tone, no edge. "I'd have to check," she said. "Please do," James said. She didn't. James reached into his jacket pocket. He removed his personal business card. Matte black, thick stock, his name in clean letterpress type, James Whitfield. He held it out to Diana. She took it, looked at it. Something moved behind her eyes, a brief recalibration, a flicker, then it closed. "This doesn't change what the system shows," she said. She set the card on the drinks ledge, like something being filed. James watched her do it. He thought about Gerald Hooper, about a hallway in 1989, about a man who delivered rejection so smoothly you almost felt grateful for the delivery. Some things changed their shape, their vocabulary, their packaging, but the architecture stayed the same. Troy reappeared. He'd been briefed in the galley. The easy smile was still there, but had shifted quality, less friendly, more fixed. "So we're thinking economy might actually have more room." "I'm not going to economy," James said. Flat, clear. Troy blinked. The smile flickered. "The thing is company policy." "I know the policy," James said. "I helped write it." He looked at Troy directly. "The policy states that a passenger with a confirmed boarding pass cannot be involuntarily reassigned without written notification and a documented system error with a supervisor's signature. Has that happened?" Silence. Troy looked at Diana. Diana looked at the floor. Briefly, then back up. "Captain," she said, "I think we need security." In row 4, Deborah Simmons pressed record. She'd been watching since James first stopped in the aisle. 40 years old, from Minneapolis, in aviations for the second time this week for her sister's wedding rehearsal. She worked in hospital administration. She knew what it looked like when an institution made a decision first and constructed the justification second. She'd fought the play her entire career and lost more often than she liked to count. She pressed record, didn't announce it, just tilted her phone toward the aisle and kept her expression neutral. Officer Lena Marsh arrived from the gate. 34. She had the posture of someone who'd been reading situations since before she had the uniform. She read this one in about 4 seconds, and the reading made her slow her walk slightly before she cleared the jetway door. Not stop, just slow. She looked at James. "Sir," she said, "can you walk me through what's happening from your perspective?" It was the professionally correct question. James felt something almost like relief, brief, conditional, that someone had asked it. "I have a confirmed boarding pass for seat 2A, he said. "Paid 3 days ago, scanned valid by your crew 12 minutes ago. The seat has been given to someone else without documentation or explanation." "I haven't raised my voice. I've asked to see the system record that justifies the reassignment. That request has not been answered." Lena turned to Diana. "Is there printed error report?" she asked. "With a supervisor's signature? The system." Diana started. "A printed report," Lena said. "Has it been written?" A pause that was 1 second too long. Lena looked at James again. Then she did something Diana had not been expecting. She stepped back physically. Not away from the cabin. She was still present, still doing her job. But she stepped back from the lane Diana had been laying out. The lane that ended with James walking toward economy. She stepped back and she stood and she was quiet. Back in the galley, Ava stood alone. Her phone was in her left hand. Screen down, already recording. She was staring at the equipment rack like it had said something she needed to think about. Because here was what nobody in the training binder covered. What do you do when you see something that isn't in the binder? Green. She'd held herself, watched the light change. The boarding pass was valid. Seat 2A, name matched. No flags. And then Diana had taken the iPad from her hands in one clean motion and turned the screen off. Ava pressed her thumb against the side of her phone to check it was still running. Still recording. Good. From the cabin, she could hear Diana's voice, controlled authority, the register of someone who expected compliance. She could hear Frank's lower register behind it. She could not hear James, which made sense, because James wasn't making noise. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Every difficult passenger scenario in training involved someone who escalated. Volume, gestures, the energy that gave the crew something to point at. James hadn't done any of that. He'd asked 2 questions, stated a fact, sat down, and somehow that calmness was making Diana more tense, not less. Like his stillness was its own kind of pressure. Then Diana came around the galley corner. Troy was a half-step behind. Diana went to the narrow counter and pulled open a drawer, checking something that didn't need checking. A habit. The hands needing to be doing something. He's still sitting there, Troy said. I know, Frank said. Going to. Troy leaned against the cart. The smile was gone entirely now. You really think he printed that card himself? Diana made a short sound. Not quite a laugh. His name's actually on the manifest, Troy said. I pulled it up myself before Frank came out. Whitfield, James. Seat 2A, full fare, 3 days ago. Silence. The manifest was updated, Diana said. Diana, it reflects the current assignment. That's what a manifest is for. If he makes a complaint, complaints get filed. Reviewed closed. Takes 3 months and to form, and someone in an office in Dallas who's never set foot on a plane. She pushed the drawer shut. He'll be in economy before we push back. Ava was standing less than 4 feet away. In the narrow shadow of the galley, where the overhead panel changed the lighting slightly. Neither of them had looked toward her. Troy said, what if he's somebody? Diana said, he's not dressed like somebody. Okay, but what if he's not? 9 years. You learn to read people. Ava was reading people. She was reading both of them. And she was deciding something that the training manual had absolutely nothing to say about. Diana picked up the iPad, walked back to the cabin. Troy followed. Ava stayed in the galley for exactly 5 more seconds. Then she walked back to the cabin entrance and stood where she could see the manifest screen on Diana's iPad. She watched Diana's fingers move across the screen. Find the seating log, find row 2, find the field marked 2A. Delete it. Clean. Fast. The name disappeared. White space where James Whitfield had been. Diana set the iPad face down on the drinks counter. There, she said to no one. Ava's fingers closed around her phone in her jacket pocket. She had seen the delete. She had seen all of it. And now she understood that this wasn't a bad judgment call or a miscommunication or a policy being applied too broadly. This was something someone was choosing deliberately in real time. James stood in the aisle again. He'd seen Diana's hands, too. He reached into his pocket for his phone. Rachel, he said when she answered on the first ring. Log everything from the past 30 minutes. Don't intervene yet. I need this to finish. Rachel's voice, crisp, no wasted syllables, already running the board alert queue. Standing by. He ended the call. He looked at Diana, who had set the iPad face down and turned toward him with the expression of someone who has done what they came to do. Sir, she said, I'm going to need you to. She stopped, because James had sat down again, back in his seat. Quietly. No statement, no theater. He just sat the way a person sits in the chair they paid for. And he looked at Diana Cole with the same patience he'd been carrying all morning. Go ahead, he said. And Diana, for the first time since he'd entered this cabin, did not have the next line. Ava Colton stood at the galley entrance with her phone recording in her jacket pocket, and she waited. Because the scanner had said green. Because she'd seen the delete. Because 23 years old or not, first assignment or not. She understood that the record was what lasted. She waited, and James Whitfield waited, and the plane sat at gate B14, engines not yet turning, as the morning light crossed the Atlanta tarmac from pale gold into the flat, clear brightness of a day that had decided, finally, what it was going to be. The galley was 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, barely enough room for 2 people without touching elbows. A coffee maker. A cart locked into its bracket, narrow drawers with foil-sealed cups stacked in rows, the whole space humming with the quiet of equipment waiting to be needed. Ava stood in it alone now. Diana and Troy had gone back to the cabin. Frank was somewhere near the cockpit door. Lena Marsh was still positioned near the forward bulkhead, not intervening, not leaving, just present, the way a person stands when they haven't decided which way to move yet. Ava's phone was in her left hand, screen down, still recording. She was staring at the coffee maker because looking at anything else meant looking at the thing she'd just watched happen. And she needed 30 seconds to process that before she went back out there. Green. She'd held the scanner herself. Watched the readout. The boarding pass was valid, seat 2A, name matched, no flags, no holds. Then Diana had taken the iPad in one smooth motion and turned the screen off and said, "I've got this," and that had been the end of Ava's first professional act on her first solo flight. And then she'd watched Diana open the manifest and delete a name, not correct an error, not flag a conflict. Delete, clean, fast, practiced. That word had been sitting in Ava's chest like something swallowed wrong, practiced, like the fingers knew the motion, like they'd made it before. She pressed her thumb against the side of her phone to confirm it was still running. Still running. She thought about the training binder. She'd read it 3 times during certification. Every scenario had a correct procedure. Every difficult situation had a protocol. The binder was 42 pages and covered everything from medical emergencies to disruptive passengers to equipment failures. It had nothing for this. Nothing for, what do you do when the difficult situation is not the passenger? From the cabin, Diana's voice filtered back, controlled, authoritative. The register of someone who expected the situation to resolve in a specific direction. Behind it, lower, Frank's voice, and underneath both of them, nothing. No counter voice, no escalation. James Whitfield was not making noise. Ava had noticed that from the beginning and hadn't stopped noticing it. Every training module on difficult passengers assumed volume, assumed body language that gave you something to respond to. James had given them nothing except a valid boarding pass and 2 quiet questions and the particular patience of someone who understood that the record mattered more than the moment. She'd seen that kind of patience once before. Her father in a school meeting when Ava was 12, arguing calmly for 20 minutes with a vice principal who had already decided the answer. Her father had not raised his voice. He had asked 3 questions. He had not gotten what he came for that day. But he had built a record that mattered 8 months later when the pattern became undeniable. She'd been 12. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. She straightened, checked her uniform, put both hands at her sides, and walked back toward the cabin entrance. She stopped at the edge of the galley and looked out at the first-class cabin. James in seat 2B, hands folded, watching Diana with the sick expression he'd had since she first saw him in the aisle. Diana at the forward position, tablet face down on the drinks ledge, arms crossed slightly, performing composure. The matte black card sat beside the drinks ledge where Diana had set it. The torn boarding pass. Diana had torn it. Ava had seen that too, right down the center fold, lay in 2 pieces next to the card. The webs were in 2A and the window seat. Richard had his phone out. Carol was looking at her hands. Deborah Simmons in row 4 had not lowered her own phone. Lena Marsh stood near the bulkhead, watching. Troy came back around the galley curtain. He almost walked into Ava. He pulled up short. They stood a foot apart in the narrow galley entrance. "You good?" he said. "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone trying to determine if a statement is true. Then he looked away. He went to the card and pulled a drawer open and closed it without taking anything out. "Diana's handled situations like this before," he said to the drawer, not to Ava. Ava said nothing. "Guy's got a boarding pass, fine, but the system's showing a reassignment, and that's what stands. That's how it works." "The system showed valid when I scanned him," Ava said. Troy looked at her now. "Diana checked it after," he said. "Diana updated it after," Ava said. The words came out steady. She hadn't planned them. They arrived, and she let them arrive. Troy's jaw moved slightly, something calculating happening behind his eyes. Not malice, more like a person doing rapid math and not enjoying the answer. "You need to be careful," he said, low, not threatening, almost like advice. "I know," she said. She stepped past him and went back to the cabin entrance. James had his phone out. Not to call anyone, not yet. He was looking at the screen with the focus of someone reading something important, but the screen was dark. He was thinking, that was all. Sitting in seat 2B in a first-class cabin he'd paid to be in, doing what 60 years had taught him to do in situations designed to make him react before he was ready. He was thinking. The boarding pass pieces were on the drinks ledge. The card was to exactly where Diana had set it. He looked at them without looking like he was looking at them. The peripheral awareness of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where what you showed on your face was as consequential as what you said out loud. Diana had deleted his name from the manifest. He'd watched her hands. He'd seen the delete happen in real time, which meant the manifest now showed a clean reassignment with no history of his original booking. So unless someone pulled the raw audit log from the back-end system, which Diana almost certainly didn't know could be done remotely. Rachel could pull it. Rachel could pull it in 45 seconds from her desk in Phoenix. He reached for his phone. Deborah Simmons in row 4 was watching him. He could see her in his peripheral without turning. Her phone was angled toward the aisle. Recording, he was fairly sure. He didn't mind. He minded the opposite. He minded the flights where nobody had a phone out, where what happened simply happened with no record. Rachel, he said when she picked up. Already on it, she said. I pulled the audit log 2 minutes ago when you called the first time. The original entry is clean. Whitfield James, seat 2A, full fare, booked 71 hours ago. The update was timestamped at 6:04 a.m. this morning. 6:04. James was quiet for a moment. I reached the gate at 6:18, he said. Yes, Rachel said, 14 minutes before he arrived. The reassignment hadn't been triggered by seeing him. It had been made before anyone in this crew had laid eyes on him, which meant the decision had been reached on the basis of, what? His name. A name that could carry assumptions. Or someone had pulled up the passenger manifest during pre-board prep, looked at the name, looked at what the name might mean, and made a judgment that James Whitfield would be easier to redirect than to seat. Or maybe someone had seen him on the gate camera system and made a call either way. It had not started when Diana looked at him in the cabin. It had started before he got here. Keep the log, James said. Don't send it anywhere yet. I'll tell you when. Understood. Board duty line is standing by. He ended the call. He looked out the window. The tarmac was fully lit now. The pale gold of early morning had burned off into the flat, clear light of a day that didn't make promises. Fuel trucks. A luggage train pulling away from the adjacent gate. 2 ground crew in orange vests talking, one of them pointing at something on a clipboard. Ordinary morning. Ordinary airport. He thought about the 14 people who'd each had their own version of this morning and gotten off the plane. Frank Slade came out of the cockpit again, second time, which was notable. Captains came out once for the official intervention, the establishment of hierarchy. A second emergence meant something had changed. Frank's face had changed too, not dramatically, but the certainty had developed a fissure. He moved differently. He stood near the forward bulkhead and looked at the cabin in a way that suggested the story been operating inside had started to feel less solid than it had 20 minutes ago. He had his phone in his hand, down at his side, not raised. Diana, he said. She turned. He tilted his head toward the galley. She followed. Troy started to follow. Frank stopped, looked at Troy. Not you. Troy stopped. He stood in the aisle, the smile gone, and looked at James. James looked at him. What was exchanged wasn't words. It was the simple awareness that both of them could feel the room changing, and neither of them knew exactly which direction the change was moving. Troy looked away first. Frank's voice was low, working harder than it had been 30 minutes ago. Operations called the gate desk, he said. They got a flag from the booking system. Diana waited. The flag was specific. Whitfield James, seat 2A, full fare booking. When the assessments changed, it triggered a secondary review. That review went to someone in Dallas who recognized the name. Diana was very still. Recognized it how? That, Frank said, is what I'd like to understand. Ava was at the galley entrance. Not inside it, beside the frame, back against the bulkhead, close enough to hear, doing something that looked like checking a supply list on her phone. She was not checking a supply list. Is there documentation for the reassignment? Frank asked. The manifest reflects. Diana. Single word, like a door easing shut, a pause. The manifest reflects the update I made during pre-board prep, Diana said. Each word placed carefully, precise in the way that precision becomes a tell. You made the update, Frank said. There was a conflict in the Diana. Quitter now. Which was worse? She stopped. Frank stood there. His jaw worked slightly. The small, tight movement of a man whose internal accounting had just come out differently than expected. He was choosing between the thing he wanted to say and the thing he should. "Pull up the raw log," he said. Unedited, timestamp included. Diana's hand moved toward the iPad, then stopped. The raw log would require operations too. "I know what it requires," Frank said. "I've seen them generated in under a minute." He looked at her. Really looked. Not the operational scan, the human one. The one you use when you've started to suspect the story you were told has a different shape than the story that actually happened. "Do you want me to call them? Or do you want to tell me what happened this morning?" The galley was quiet except for the coffee maker's hum. Diana said nothing, and the nothing was its own kind of answer. Frank pulled out his phone and dialed operations. He turned slightly away from Diana while it rang, not for privacy, just the instinctive body language of someone who has stopped trusting the person standing beside them. He was on the call for 11 minutes, not 45 seconds, 11 minutes, because the operations officer in Dallas didn't just pull the log. She asked Frank to hold while she escalated to a supervisor, because as the name on the flag had already been kicked to a secondary review, and the supervisors wanted to know what was happening on that aircraft before she released anything. Frank stood in the galley with his phone pressed to his ear and his free hand flat against the counter and said, "Yes, and I understand, and I'll wait," and yes 3 separate times. Diana stood 2 feet away and did not speak. Ava did not move from the bulkhead. The coffee maker kept humming. When the operations officer came back, she confirmed the log verbally first. Then she said she was printing and transmitting it to the aircraft printer simultaneously. Frank thanked her, ended the call. He looked at Diana. He didn't say anything yet. He waited for the printer. It ran for 45 seconds, grinding, the thermal paper coming out warm. He took the page, read it once standing in the galley. Read it a second time, walking back toward the cabin. He was holding it when he came through the curtain. Deborah Simmons's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Read the number. Read it again because the first reading hadn't processed correctly. She had posted the clip. 68 seconds, no caption, raw footage of Diana telling James his seat had been reassigned while James held out a boarding pass she refused to examine. To her personal account on X 22 minutes ago. Not for engagement, as a record. The way she backed up important files to a cloud she trusted more than her own device. 800,000 views. In 22 minutes, she lowered the phone slightly, looked at the cabin, looked at the number again. Because she hadn't posted it for views, she'd posted it as evidence. And 800,000 meant someone with an audience had found it and done something fint with it that she hadn't controlled or intended. She found the repost driving the traffic. A verified aviation industry account with 2.3 million followers. They'd pulled a screenshot from Apex Airways' website, the About page, the leadership section, with a small photograph of a man in a dark jacket, patient expression, clear eyes. Below it, 8 words. "This is their own CEO. Watch the video again." Deborah set the phone face up on her table and looked at the front of the cabin. At James in seat 2B, hands folded, watching the galley curtain with the expression of someone who understood that waiting was not the same thing as losing. At the torn boarding pass on the drinks ledge, at the matte black car door beside it, she thought, 800,000 people are watching this right now, she thought. They know something that nobody in this cabin knows yet. She stood up. Her voice came out at the register she used for meetings that had gotten off track. Not loud, not theatrical, the pitch that made people pay attention, because it sounds like someone who had something worth saying. "Excuse me," the cabin turned. Diana coming back from the galley with Frank behind her. Frank, holding a single sheet of thermal paper, stopped at the curtain. "This man has a valid boarding pass," Deborah said. "I watched him scan it. I watched the screen go green. And I have been watching what's happened in this cabin for the past 36 minutes. She paused. "I also have video, which currently has 800,000 people watching it. The number landed the way weight lands, not all at once, settling. The man in the charcoal suit put his tablet down. The woman with the cashmere throw turned fully in her seat. In row 6, the couple who'd been dozing were suddenly awake, leaning forward to reconstruct what they'd missed. Frank went very still. Troy, near the curtain, said involuntarily, "How many?" 800,000, Deborah said, and going up. Diana's face held. But something behind it shifted. The interior adjustment of a person who has understood that the situation has left the room they were managing it in. Troy looked at Diana. She looked at Deborah, and then Richard Webb set down his phone. Carol put her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. And then Richard Webb, who had accepted a champagne flute and a seat that wasn't his and had not asked a single question, stood up. Slowly, deliberately. "We didn't ask for this seat," he said. "We were told there'd been a mix-up, that it was handled." He looked at James briefly, then back at Diana. "It's clear it wasn't, and we'd like no part of whatever is actually happening here." Diana opened her mouth. Richard didn't wait for it. He and Carol moved back down the aisle toward row 6, quietly, without drama. The cabin tracked them with the focused attention of people witnessing something that had weight. Seat 2A sat empty. James was in 2B. He didn't move to 2A. That wasn't the point anymore. The point had stopped being the seat about 30 minutes ago. Deborah checked her phone again. Not because she expected the number to have moved, just the reflex. It had moved. 1 million views. She put the phone face down. Some things don't need to be watched in real time. Lena Marsh crossed the cabin. She walked to Diana, stopped, looked at her with the expression of someone who had done a calculation and was not satisfied with the answer, but was going to live with it. "I need to step back from this," Lena said. Diana, "What? I can't support the removal," Lena said. Her voice was even. Not apologetic. Clear. There's no documentation. There's a valid boarding pass on record. There's video that 1 million people have seen. My job is to protect people. Right now, I cannot identify who needs protecting in a way that makes removing this passenger defensible. She stepped back. Physically. Diana looked at her the way you look at something that should have stayed where it was. "You're making a mistake," Diana said. Lena said, "I already made it," and she was quiet. Ava Colton stepped fully out of the galley and into the cabin. She didn't hover at the entrance. She walked to the center of the aisle and stood there and looked at Frank Slade directly. "Captain," she said. Her voice was shaking. Not much. She was pressing the shake down into something manageable. But it was audible. Because she was 23 years old on her first solo assignment, and she was about to say something irreversible to the highest authority on this aircraft, and the shake was honest. She said it anyway. "I submitted an incident flag to the operations compliance queue 34 minutes ago," she said. "It includes recording of a conversation in the galley between Miss Cole and Mr. Harmon, and the timestamp of the manifest update I witnessed in real time." Diana went rigid. "But you recorded crew." "I was in the galley during a pre-sea service check," Ava said. "I was where I was assigned to be. I used the crew operations portal to submit because the interface states that all flag submissions are logged and time-stamped automatically." She paused, not for effect, because she needed the breath. "I knew it would create a record. That's why I used it." "You're a trainee," Diana said. The word placed like a weight to scale. "I know what I saw," Ava said. Diana took a step forward, the step of someone re-establishing hierarchy through proximity. "Whatever you think you recorded is going to cost. Let her finish," James said. From seat 2B, without looking back. 2 words. Diana stopped. The cabin was very still. Frank looked at Ava, then at Diana. Then at the thermal paper in his hand. His jaw was doing the small, tight movement of Amit, whose accounting had produced an answer he'd been trying to avoid. Deborah's phone buzzed in her bag. She didn't take it out. She already knew it was going up. Frank Slade set the printed log down on the drinks ledge. Next to the torn boarding pass. Next to the matte black card. A small accumulation of a morning's worth of evidence, sitting on the ledge where Diana had set each piece like she was filing something away. He stood in the center of the cabin and looked at James. Not with authority, not with the operational certainty he'd brought out of the cockpit twice this morning. With the expression of a man who had added up what was in front of him and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to be. "Who are you?" Frank said. A real question. For the first time all morning, a real one. James considered it. He considered the version of this where he answered right now. Title, equity stake, board authorization, 30 seconds and done. He'd the power to end this since he walked through the door. He'd chosen not to use it because the point had never been to win. The point had been to see. He'd seen. Seat 2A, full fare. I'd like the raw log reviewed by someone with authority to act on it. Frank looked at the log in his hand. He looked at Diana. Diana was still standing straight, still holding the posture of someone who believed that composure and control were the same thing. But her hands had found each other, fingers interlaced, pressing together, the body giving away what the face was working to hold back. Troy had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not the quiet of someone following a lead. The quiet of someone who had looked at the view from where he was standing and understood, with the clarity of a thing arriving all at once, that he did not want to be there. He sat down on the jump seat, put his elbows on his knees, looked at his shoes. Deborah, in row 4, finally took out her phone. 1.4 million. She looked at it for a long moment, then she put it face down in her bag. And she looked at the front of the cabin. At James sitting patient and still. At Ava in the aisle with her hands finally not shaking. At Frank holding the log. At Diana still upright, still composed, but the composure costing more, now visibly costing more, the weight of it showing in small ways. At Troy on the jump seat, looking at his shoes. At Lena near the wall. At the older man in row 9, white-haired, a cane hooked over the armrest, who had been completely still since all of this started, and who was sitting very straight now, watching the front of the cabin with an expression she couldn't name yet. She put her phone away. She waited. From the galley, Ava's phone made a sound, a notification ping. She looked at it. Read the screen. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Frank saw it. What is it? The compliance queue flagged my submission as high priority, she said. Operations has opened a review. They're pulling the full audit trail, a pause, and they're trying to reach the board duty line. Diana said nothing. Troy looked up from his shoes for the first time in several minutes. Frank set the printed log down very carefully. The care of someone handling evidence who wants to be precise about that. He looked at James, and James stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the cabin, at every person in it, and he said, "My name is James Whitfield." He said it at normal volume, not a speech, not a declaration. The volume of a man finished his sentence he'd started 35 years ago and was only now getting to the end of. "My name is James Whitfield. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Airways. I hold 25% equity in this company. I have been part of this organization for 11 years. He stopped. Let it land the way weight lands, not all at once, but settling, finding the low places, filling them. The man in the charcoal suit made a sound. Not a word, just an exhale, the compressed sound of understanding arriving faster than the body was ready for it. The woman with the cashmere throw had both hands over her mouth. Deb Simmons was already filming. She'd never stopped. Richard Webb, in row 6, closed his eyes, and Diana Cole stood in the aisle of a plane she'd worked for 9 years and felt the floor do something it had never done to her before. It dropped, not visibly, not in any way the cabin could see, but she felt it, the specific interior sensation of standing on something you believed was solid and discovering in a single moment that the solid thing was a story you'd been telling yourself, and the story had just ended. James continued. "I booked this seat 3 days ago under my real name, full fare. I arranged no advance notice. No staff, no identification beyond what any passenger carries." He paused. "I did that deliberately. The cabin was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. That low, constant breath of recycled air that you stop hearing after the first 5 minutes on a plane and suddenly hear again when everything else stops. For the past 3 months," James said, "I have received 14 formal complaints from Apex Airways passengers, all first-class cabins. All described in the same shape of experience, a boarding pass question when no one else's was, a seat that somehow wasn't available, a tone that shifted in ways that had nothing to do with ticketing." He looked at Diana. I needed to understand what that meant. Not from a boardroom, from a seat. He looked at the torn boarding pass on the drinks ledge. "Now I understand." Diana opened her mouth. James looked at her. She closed it. "I've been in this cabin for over an hour," he said. "I showed identification. I showed a valid boarding pass that was scanned green by a crew member who was then relieved of her scanner." He looked at Ava briefly. "I watched the seating manifest be edited in real time. I watched the original record of my booking disappear. I watched all of this without raising my voice, without threatening anyone, without doing anything except sitting in the seat I paid for. He stopped again. "I want that on record," he said, "because there are going to be a lot of words written about this morning. I want it clear what actually happened." The boarding process out had stopped. Economy passengers were backed up in the jetway, a column of people with rolling bags and coffee cups receiving no information from the gate agent, who was receiving confusing signals from the crew channel and had made the decision to hold boarding until someone told her what to do. The plane sat, gate B14 sat, Atlanta sat, and James Whitfield reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He pressed 3 buttons. "Rachel," he said, "put them on speaker." A pause of 4 seconds. Then a voice came through the phone. Male, measured, the authority of someone who was used to being the room that other rooms waited on. "This is David Crane, Apex Airways Board, duty line. We've reviewed the operational log, the manifest audit trail, and the recording submitted to the compliance queue 40 minutes ago. We're prepared to proceed." The voice filled the cabin the way a voice fills a space when everyone in it has stopped breathing slightly. Frank Slade looked like a man watching something he'd built with confidence turn out to have been built on the wrong foundation. Troy had gone the color of old paper. Diana was still standing straight, still holding the posture, but her hands, hers had found each other again, pressing, the body telling the truth when the face was working too hard to hold something else. "David," James said, "for the record, who altered the seating manifest at 6:04 this morning. David Crane. The system log attributes the change to employee AID AC 4471. Diana Cole, senior flight attendant." Diana said, "Diana," James said. One word, the door closed. She stopped. Frank Slade took off his captain's hat. Just took it off. Held it at his side, a small gesture. Barely visible. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were watching the front of the cabin instead of the edges of it. But Deborah Simmons in row 4 saw it. She'd been watching edges all morning. He walked to the drinks ledge, picked up the printed log, looked at it again, though he'd already read it twice, set it back down. Then he turned to James. And he said something that nobody in the cabin had been expecting from him. Not at this point, not after everything that had accumulated in the past hour. "I owe you more than an explanation," he said. The cabin shifted. Not visibly, something interior. The quality of attention changed. "I came out of that cockpit this morning," Frank said, "and I made a decision in under a minute. I decided to trust my crew's read over a passenger's account." He stopped, his jaw tightened, released. "I told myself that was protocol, operational hierarchy, a captain's job, support the crew, keep the environment stable." He looked at the hat in his hand. "But that's not what it was." James waited. "I looked at you," Frank said. "And I decided something before I asked a single question. That's not protocol. That's not hierarchy." He looked up. "That's just what I did." He stopped. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the speech of someone practiced at this kind of honesty. It was the specific, ungainly candor of a man who had gotten to the end of a calculation and found the answer worse than expected, and had decided to say so out loud instead of managing it quietly. James looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Frank nodded. "Thank you isn't enough," James said, "but it's a start. And starts matter more than people give them credit for." He turned to the phone. "David, Captain Slade is to be placed on administrative review pending internal investigation. Note his full cooperation." From the phone, Frank exhaled a long, controlled breath. He sat down on the jump seat that Troy had vacated. He put the hat on his knees and looked at his hands and was still. Diana said, "I want to speak." James turned to her. "I have the right to." "You do," he said. "Go ahead." She looked at him. The last calculation of someone who had run out of other calculations. "I've been with this airline 9 years, she said. "Perfect safety record, commendations. Passenger satisfaction scores in the top 15% of cabin crew system-wide." "I know your record," James said. That stopped her. Her mouth stayed open for a moment. "I read your file before I booked this flight," he said. "Not because I suspected you. I read the files on every crew member working the routes that generated complaints. You had strong marks, which made it harder, not easier, to understand what those 14 passengers described." Diana's mouth closed, opened again. 9 years is a long time to build something," James said. "I know what that costs, and I'm sorry that this morning is going to define a significant portion of what comes next for you." He paused, but I need you to hear something. He looked at her directly, not with anger, not with the specific satisfaction that vindication sometimes generates in people who've been wronged and are now watching consequences arrive. With something harder than both of those things. With the tiredness of someone who had been having this conversation, in various forms, for 35 years. The recording that will now be part of your employment record, he said. You said, people like that in first class. I need you to hear that sentence. Not as evidence, not as the thing that got caught on tape. As something you believed enough to say out loud in a galley on a Tuesday morning like it was completely ordinary. He stopped, because that's what those 14 passengers heard. Not a bad day, not a mistake under pressure. Ordinary. Diana's eyes were bright. I didn't know. She started. That I owned part of the company, James said. I know. That's the entire point of this morning. His voice stayed level. Still the river. It shouldn't matter. And it does matter. And as long as both of those things are true at the same time, there is work to do. Diana sat down, not dramatically, not with tears or a statement. She just sat on the armrest of the forward seat. Like her legs had made the decision, her mind was still resisting. She put one hand over her eyes. She didn't cry. Or if she did, she hid it well enough that only the woman with the cashmere throw, who had been watching closely for the past 40 minutes, could see the slight movement of Diana's shoulders. The standing was done. David Crane's voice came through the phone again, even, deliberate. The voice of a process being set in motion. Per board authorization and emergency protocol, Diana Cole and Troy Harmon are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Employee access has been suspended pending review. HR and legal have been notified. Formal investigation begins within 72 hours. Troy, still on the jump seat, made a sound. Small, involuntary. Not a word, just the sound of something ending. The compressed noise of a version of yourself that you'd been maintaining for a long time suddenly not being required anymore. He nodded. To no one specific. And he stood and he went to the crew compartment in the galley, and he came back with his bag, and he stood near the door. He didn't look at Diana. He looked at Ava, and he said, quietly enough that only the first few rows caught it. But the cabin was quiet enough the first few rows meant most of it. You did the right thing. Ava said nothing, but she held his gaze, and she didn't look away until he did. He walked off the plane without looking back. Diana took longer. She gathered herself with the careful deliberateness of someone making sure the basic functions were still operating. Coat on. Bag from the crew compartment. Each action done with the precision of a person who has learned that the body keeps working even when everything else has stopped. She stopped at the edge of the galley. She didn't look at James. She looked at the cabin, at the faces, at the phones, at Deborah Simmons in row 4, at the man in the charcoal suit, at the woman with the cashmere throw, who met her gaze and didn't look away. At Richard and Carol Webb in row 6, Richard with his eyes on the floor. Carol watching Diana with an expression that was not unkind, but was comfortable. Diana looked at all of it. At the small museum on the drinks ledge, the torn boarding pass, the matte black card, the printed log, and at everything they represented about a morning that had started at 6:04 a.m. and was now being documented by a board in Phoenix and watched by people on phones in cities she would never visit. Then she walked off the plane. No statement, no last word, just the sound of her footsteps in the jetway, getting quieter, then gone. Nobody said anything for a moment. Not cruel silence, not triumphant. Just the silence of a thing that has finished, and a room full of people who all know it and are letting it be what it is. Lena Marsh released a breath she'd apparently been holding since before the board call started. She rolled her neck. One side, then the other. The sound of someone physically standing down from a posture maintained too long. She looked at James. Officer Marsh, he said. Sir, you had a choice this morning, he said. You made the easier one first. Then you made the harder one. He paused. I appreciate the harder one. I should have made it earlier, Lena said. Yes, James said. Simply. Not cruelly. Just true. But you made it. He looked at the phone. David Lena Marsh, security officer. She cooperated before board involvement. Stepped back from the removal attempt on her own. I'd like that on record. Noted, David said. Lena nodded. She straightened, and she returned to her position near the forward bulkhead, doing the job the way it was supposed to be done. James looked at Frank, still sitting on the jump seat with the hat on his knees. "Frank," he said. Frank looked up. "You're not flying today," James said. "Not this flight." Frank nodded, expected, "But I have a request," James said. "I want you to free something up. What happened this morning? What you decided and why." The not the official incident language. What it felt like from the inside in real time when the decision made sense to you. He paused. "I'm going to use it in crew training." Frank blinked. "As an example of what went wrong, as an example of how it feels when it's going wrong and you can't see it yet," James said. "Where it felt like protocol. Where you'd have said, if some son asked you in that first minute, that you were following procedure." He stopped. "That version, that's the one that needs to be in the room when we train people. Because that's the one that's real." Frank was quiet. "Nobody wants to read that," he said. "Everyone needs to read it," James said. Frank looked at his hands. "Okay," he said, one word. Heavy as anything said that morning. Richard Webb was standing in the aisle. He'd come forward from row 6 without announcement. Just stood, came forward, stopped near the drinks ledge with his hands at his sides. The expression of a man who had decided something and was doing it before he could change his mind. He picked up the 2 torn halves of James's boarding pass. Held them out. Not as a gesture, not symbolically, just held them out because they were on the ledge and they belonged to James, and this was the available small thing. James took them, looked at Richard. "We didn't know," Richard said. "I want you to believe that. We were told it was a mix-up, that it was handled." He paused. "We should have asked more questions." "Yes, James," he said. "Not unkind, not punishing, accurate. You benefited from not asking," James said. "That's worth sitting with. Not to make you feel terrible about this morning, but because that moment, when something feels slightly off and you accept the explanation without looking closer, that moment has a cost. Sometimes you pay it. Sometimes someone else does." Richard absorbed this. Carol had come to stand beside him. She took his arm. "We'll stay in our seats," Richard said. "If that's all right." "Go where you were going," James said. "That's all I ever wanted to do." They went back to row 6. Then James looked at Ava. She was still in the center of the aisle, not hovering, standing, with the quality of someone who had decided to be exactly where they were. "One more thing," James said to David on the phone. "I'd like the board to process a crew status change. Ava Colton, currently listed as trainee, is to be moved to full active roster effective today. HR processes the paperwork before we land." David confirmed. Ava stared at him. "Same work," James said. "Same duties. But you're not a trainee anymore." He paused. "And I'd like you to consider a secondment. 6 months with our crew standards team, working on the bias response training we're building from this incident. You'd still fly, just with a secondary role." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Why me?" she said. "Because you were scared," he said. "And you read the small print." She held that for a moment, then almost laughed, the sound that comes out when something arrives and you weren't ready for it and all your body can do is make a noise somewhere between relief and disbelief. He held out his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm. He noticed. "David," James said into the phone, "one last thing. The 14 existing complaints, I want to formally reopen all of them, full review, individual outreach to each person. Personal correspondence, not form letters. Remediation determined case by case." "That's going to be a significant undertaking," David said. "David," James said. A pause. "Yes," David said, "it is." "Then let's start," James said. "This week." He ended the call. Rachel's voice came through his earpiece. "New crew ready. Captain Rezis is at the gate, standby rotation. 2 replacement crew cleared. 4 minutes. Tell them the cabin has been briefed," James said. "Already done." He put the phone in his pocket. Captain Reyes arrived in 4 minutes exactly. He came through the jetway with the settled authority of someone who understood that his job right now was to move things forward, not add weight to what had already accumulated. Younger than Frank, clear-eyed, he shook James's hand with the grip of someone who meant it. "Captain Reyes, James Whitfield." Reyes looked at him steadily. "Ready to get you to Houston. That's all I ever wanted," James said. Reyes went forward. The replacement crew moved through their setup with the quiet competence of people who'd been briefed and were doing the job. The economy boarding line started moving. The gate agent's voice came over the PAA, apologizing for the delay, asking passengers to have boarding passes ready. The ordinary machinery of aviation reassembling around an extraordinary morning. James started toward seat 2A. He stopped because the older man in row 9 was standing up. He'd been sitting there since before boarding opened. Still, straight-backed, watching, saying nothing. Just present. The present that takes up more space than it appears to, because the person occupying it is paying full attention. He was moving slowly, reaching for the cane hooked over the armrest, the habit of it. No hesitation, 10,000 repetitions, and then he was upright. White-haired, close-cropped, 70s or beyond, the kind of old that looks earned. He walked forward, one step, then another. The cabin tracked him. The way room tracks movement when something understands before it can explain itself that this matters. He stopped 6 feet from James. He looked at James with an expression that Deborah Simmons, watching from row 4, had been trying to name since the man first sat up straight during the board call. She found it now. Recognition. Not of James specifically, of the shape of what James had done, of what it meant to someone who had been waiting 3 years to see it. "My name is Harold Briggs," he said. His voice was low and deliberate. The voice of a man who had learned to use words carefully because he'd learned they were finite. "I have a son," Harold said. "His name is Marcus." He stopped. James waited. He was good at waiting. "Marcus worked in aviation," Harold said. "Cabin crew. 3 years. He was good at it. People liked him. His reviews said things like natural and professional. Made passengers feel welcome." He paused. 3 years ago, on a flight out of Dallas, a passenger complained that Marcus had been rude. He hadn't been. He'd asked a first-class passenger politely to move a bag from the aisle. Safety issue. The voice stayed level. Controlled. The control of someone who had processed this story many times and had gotten the emotion down to something manageable. The airline seated with the passenger. No investigation, no interview, no conversation with the other crew members who were there. Just the decision. In 48 hours, James said nothing. Marcus filed a response, Harold said. Dintilold. Documented. He kept records. He was always kill about records. A pause that carried something in it. Nobody called him back. The cabin was completely still. Even the ventilation system seemed to have quieted. He resigned 4 months later, Harold said. He told me he couldn't work somewhere that would make that call without asking him a single question. He went back to school, built something else. Harold stopped, looked briefly at the floor, then back at James. He's okay. I want to be clear about that. He's okay. The way fathers say things they've been saying for 3 years. But he loved that job, Harold said. He was made for it. And somebody who never heard his voice or looked at his face, decided what kind of person he was from a complaint form. And that was that. He looked at James with the particular weight of a father who has spent 3 years wishing something had gone differently for his son, and who has just watched something that he will carry home and describe on the phone in a voice that will go slightly unsteady at the part about the boarding pass. "I've been sitting back there this whole hour," Harold said, "watching you." He shook his head once. "Small. You didn't give them anything. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't lose patience. You just stayed in your seat, doing exactly what any person with a boarding pass has the right to do." James held his gaze. "What I kept thinking," Harold said, "was this is what I wished Marcus could have done. Not the 25%, not the board on the phone. Just stay. Just refuse to move." He stopped. "And then I thought, it shouldn't require any of that. It should require nothing. It should require a boarding pass." James stepped forward, 2 steps. He reached out and took Harold's hand in both of his. He held it. He didn't speak right away. He gave it room. Because some things get smaller when you respond too quickly, and bigger when you give them space. Then, "Thank you for telling me about Marcus." Harold nodded. "I'd like to reach out to him," James said. "This week. Not a form letter, a real conversation. About what happened to him on one of our flights. About what that decision cost him, and about what we owe him." Harold looked at him. His grip tightened slightly on James's hand. The involuntary grip of someone receiving something they'd stopped expecting. "He'd say yes," Harold said quietly. "Then I'll call him," James said. "This week." Harold held James's hand for another moment, then released it. He turned slowly, the cane finding the floor, and walked back to row 9. He sat down. He looked out the window. He didn't speak again. Nobody did. Because some moments don't need narration. Because the room already understands. Deborah Simmons kept her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the cabin and felt something she would struggle to name later that evening. Not emotion exactly, or not only. Something closer to the feeling of watching a thing you've believed in abstractly suddenly become concrete. Proof arriving for a theorem you'd accepted on faith. She thought, 1.4 million people are watching from outside. She thought, they're watching because they know this shape, because they've lived in it, because they need to see what happens when someone refuses to leave. She left her phone where it was. Captain Reyes's voice came over the intercom, smooth, even a Tuesday morning. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reyes. Welcome aboard Apex Airways Flight 1442 with service to Houston. We apologize for the delay this morning. We're expecting a smooth flight and you'll be on the ground in Houston in approximately 2 hours. On behalf of myself and our crew, thank you for your patience. A pause. Then not in the standard script, with the deliberateness of a sentence someone has decided to say, today's flight operates under the direct oversight of Apex Airways CEO James Whitfield, who is in first class. Mr. Whitfield, thank you for being here. The intercom clicked off, the cabin was quiet, and then the woman with the cashmere throw began to clap. Quiet, the sound of one person deciding, then the man in the charcoal suit, then Deborah Simmons, then the couple from row 8, then the cabin, row by row, not thunderous, not the kind of noise that travels through the fuselage. Just the sound of a room full of people who had witnessed something and were making the only available sound for having witnessed it. Harold Briggs in row 9 clapped last, slowest and longest. James did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the window. On the tarmac below and the sky above it, wide, pale, full of the kind of light that doesn't make promises. His jaw was tight, not with composure. Composure he'd had all morning. This was something composure had been holding, said at his card sledge, and said, this didn't change what the system shows. Since Frank chose a side in 45 seconds. Since he'd sat in this seat for over 90 minutes, waiting for the world to catch up to what was already true. The thing composure had been holding back was simpler than any of that. It was just this. People clapping in a first-class cabin at 7:06 in the morning because a man had stayed in his seat. He held it, eyes on the window. The plane began to move, the pushback tug doing its work. The terminal sliding past the porthole in the gentle backward drift of departure. Then the tug disengaging, the engines finding their register, the turn onto the taxiway. Atlanta fell into its morning. Terminals and fuel trucks and ground crew in Orange and other planes queuing for their own departures, all of it becoming pattern, then texture, then the abstract geometry of a city seen from the right angle. James watched it go. He thought about 9 years old on an observation deck with his uncle, watching planes from below. Somebody has to run all that. He thought about a hallway in 1989 and 30 seconds of standing in it, and the decision he made about what a closed door was going to mean. He thought about 14 people who'd had a version of this morning and gotten off the plane. He thought about Marcus Briggs, who had loved a job and lost it to a 48-hour decision made without a question, who had built something else because there was nothing else to do, whose father had stood up in row 9 with a cane and walked forward because he'd been waiting 3 years to say what he'd said. The wheels left the ground. That specific moment, the hinge between earth and air, the instant the rules change, James had never stopped noticing it. Not in 20 years of travel. The plane stops being a heavy thing rolling on ground and becomes something else entirely. The clouds came up around the windows. Then they were through them. Below, white. Above, blue. The engines settled into their cruising note. Atlanta was gone. James reached into his jacket, not the 14 complaints. Those were staying where they were. He took out a small photograph, printed on regular paper at home that morning before the car came, black and white. His mother at the kitchen table in Decatur, mid-law, eyes half closed, caught in something funny that he couldn't remember now. She'd been alive long enough to see the first come and gone before he rebuilt the second, which meant Tex, she'd seen him fail and not seen him recover. He had carried that asymmetry for a long time. He looked at the photograph. She would have had opinions about this morning. Loud ones, specific ones. Starting with, now let me ask you something, ending with a conclusion she'd already reached before the question finished. He put the photograph back. He took out his notebook. Actual paper, actual pen. The habit he'd kept since business school. The one had never broken because screens felt impermanent in a way paper didn't. He opened to a clean page. He wrote 3 words. Stopped. They saw jeans. He tapped the pen against the page. Then continued. I saw 35 years. I saw a kitchen table in Decatur and a woman reading the resume with her lips moving because she wanted to get every word right. I saw a door closing in 1989 and a hallway where I stood for 30 seconds deciding what that door was going to mean. I saw 14 complaints from people who had nothing but a boarding pass and a seat they paid for. I saw a 23-year-old woman decide who she was going to be when it was hard. I saw a man in row 9 stand up slowly and walk forward because he had something to say about his son. They saw jeans. That is the gap, the whole gap, and closing it is the work. Not with policies alone, though we need better policies, and not with training alone, though we need better training, but with the understanding that every person who walks through a door is carrying everything they have ever survived. And our job is to see that, not the jeans, the person. He stopped, read it back, put the notebook away. He looked out the window. The white was endless and smooth, the nothing that becomes everything when you look at it long enough. The space where distance becomes real, and the ground below, and the destination ahead both exist at once without either one being visible. James looked at it, then he looked away. There was work to do. There was always work to do. He opened the notebook again and kept writing.